Today we're going to look at First or Second Corinthians chapter 8, and Paul's going to talk today about giving. And there had been a real problem in the church in Jerusalem because there was extreme persecution. Just because some of the believers got saved, they would lose their jobs, lose their houses, lose their family, lose everything. And so these people would come to the church and say, "Man, we're on the street. What do we do?" And the church were real believers. And so they weren't like, "Well, be warmed and filled. That's really too bad. We hope that good things happen for you." They didn't say that. They said, "Man, come in with us." And pretty soon you had half the church who had lost everything, and then more. And they were in an extreme situation there. What would you do if you were a neighboring church? If you're a church in Macedonia, or if you're the church in Corinth, what should you do? Well, a year earlier, this church in Corinth heard about this, and they began to give. And they gave an offering, and Paul, got that money to them. Now, when Paul was in Macedonia, they gave, and the giving wasn't done. They needed more, and good things were happening. God was working, but they just needed more. So here's what Paul says to the Corinthian people about this offering and about these people in Jerusalem, and really just about giving in general. He says, "Out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity." He's talking about the people in Macedonia. They also were not rich. Now, they weren't in as bad a situation as the people in Jerusalem, but they were in no way rich, and they were actually poor, he says. But even in their poverty, they gave and gave and gave. He says in verse 3, "I testify they gave as much as they were able and beyond their ability." A lot of times we think, well, how much can I give? And we're literally asking this question, what can I give and not really feel it? What can I give and still maintain my standard of living? If you're asking that question, you haven't really started giving. If it doesn't cost you something out of your standard of living, if there's something you can't do, if you're not giving up, is it really sacrifice if you're not giving something up? And the answer is no. A sacrifice costs you something. David said, "I will not offer to God that which costs me nothing." They gave out of their poverty, beyond their ability. And he says in verse 3, entirely on their own. Now, after he says this, he's going to encourage these people to give. But before I get to that, I want you to notice three times in this passage, he calls it grace giving. He says in verse 1, the grace of God. In verse 6, an act of grace on your part. In verse 7, the grace of giving. It is God's grace that we get to give. It's a privilege for us to give. And it's something that is helping us that we get to give. It breaks the back of selfishness in our lives when we give. It's very hard to be selfish and give all at the same time. It's hard to consider ourselves and think about ourselves and want more and more and more for ourselves while we are giving. And so it's God's grace that we give. Now, throughout the Bible, we're taught tithing is the way that we start to give. In the Old Testament, they actually gave about 23% of their income. But this is a great way to start. There's really two kinds of people. There's people who tithe and people who don't in the church. And if you've never began to tithe, start there. That's just 10% of your income, and you just put it aside and you give it to God the first day of the week on Sunday. Maybe you've been tithing for a while and you're proud of yourself. 20 years ago, you started tithing, and man, 20 years later, you say, "Man, we tithe." And I would just submit to you that was great that you started to tithe, and it's good that you continued, but how are you challenging yourself spiritually? How are you challenging God? How are you putting God to the test like he told us to in Malachi chapter 3? You're not. You're given the same percentage. I encourage you, increase that percentage every year and see what God would do in your life. Well, here's what he says in verse 7. Just as you excel in everything, in faith, you excel in speech and in knowledge, in complete earnestness and in love for us, see that you excel in the grace of giving. This is not an option, he says. This is one of the pieces of growing in your spiritual life. You grow in love, you grow in knowledge, you grow in grace, but you got to grow in giving. That's why I say increase this every year. Give a higher percentage every year. Just maybe go 1% more. See what God would do in your life. Now, he gives two arguments that I would never even think of. But they're Paul's arguments, and they're amazing. Look at the first one, verse 8. I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. I'm going to compare the sacrifice you make with the sacrifice other people make. Let's see if you can be as sacrificial as the churches in Macedonia. Isn't that incredible that he says that? I wanted to see, how sincere your love is. Let's just see how sincere you are. Let's compare it. Now, can you imagine if someone said that in church? I want to see if you are as generous as the guy over here. Not that you give the same amount or more or less, but the amount of sacrifice. Let's see about that. If you're a millionaire, you've got to give a lot more to sacrifice as much as the single mom who's making $10 an hour just trying to get her family to go. Can you believe he says that? Yeah. He says, let's just see. Can you sacrifice as much? And then he goes to the ultimate. If that weren't enough, the ultimate argument. Verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that through his poverty you might become rich. Wow. Here he was. He says, Jesus gave everything up for you. He had the glories of heaven. He's with his Father all the time. And he disrobed himself of his glory and many of his powers and came to the earth for you. So you could be rich spiritually. What are you going to do in response to that? Are you going to be selfish? Or are you going to give? Are you going to be like Jesus, who gave us everything, his whole life? Or are you going to say, I don't want to give. I'll let other people suffer. How is it going to be for you? How's your giving? Maybe you have all kinds of devotion and love, and that's great. But you're weak in this area. Sunday's coming. Give. Give. If you don't tithe, start with 10%. Put God to the test. Malachi chapter 3, read it. He says, put me to the test. See if I won't open the windows of heaven and pour you a blessing you can't receive. Maybe you've been tithing for years. Go higher. Give another percent this year. Increase it again next year. See if God will not amazingly stretch your faith every year. Well, have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. Read chapter 8, and we'll see you on chapter 9 tomorrow. God bless you.